Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of March of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to discuss the Sudzha offensive operation, this legendary battle that most likely will go for ages due to the special operation that was carried out by the Russian forces. And when talking about this latest Russian Sudzha offensive operation, this offensive operation started not with the Russian breakthrough, this operation started not yesterday and not the day before yesterday. This Russian offensive operation started several days ago. If you remember, on the 7th of March of 2025, the Russians carried out massive missile strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine, and we were talking a lot about that attack because the Russians were trying to disrupt Ukrainian attention, to disturb Ukrainian attention, and to force the Ukrainians thinking that the Russians have completely different plans. If you remember, during that attack, the Russians destroyed Ukrainian positions and several gas transportation systems in the southwestern part of Ukraine, in Ternopil and Ivano-Frankovsk region. There were several explosions in Kharkov region, in Odessa, in Sumy, and the most important area of Russian attack took place in Poltava region. So here, and this is exactly was the beginning of Russian special operation in Sumy. You may ask, what is the connection between this missile strike in Poltava region that took place on the 8th and on the 7th of March of 2025 with the situation on the ground that is currently taking place in Sudzha? Very simple. The Russians during the 7th of March tried to destroy as many as possible gas transportation facilities that were located on the territory of Poltava region. A lot of gas transportation systems were destroyed, those transportation systems that Ukrainians could easily use to send gas back on the territory of Sudzha and to kill Russian soldiers that were currently located inside of the pipelines. But the Russians managed to destroy them, and most likely when the time came and when the Ukrainians realized that it's time to do something with this gas, maybe to send the gas back to the pipelines on the territory of Sumy, they couldn't do this because the systems, the facilities were completely destroyed by the Russian air missile strike. And now let's move to the Sudzha direction. So the situation and the operation was very simple. The Russian soldiers were forced and had just one simple mission. They needed to move through the 16th of kilometers of pipelines from the territory under complete Russian control towards the territory under complete Ukraine control. So let's assume that this is the Russian soldiers. They moved 16 kilometers, and the main purpose was to move through the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine and to land infantry somewhere here in this point. And later, and more precisely today, on the 9th of March, we received lots of videos from the Russian soldiers from inside of this pipeline where they were talking about this offensive operation. In this video, we can see the situation inside of this tunnel, inside of this pipeline. Significant number of Russian soldiers smoking cigarettes, talking about different things, and every single one of them was expecting for one thing: the order to begin offensive operation. The sources are saying that the Russians spent up to 2 days inside of these pipelines. The sources are saying that during this operation several Russian soldiers died because there was still gas, there was still a small amount of gas that left, and sometimes there was lots of cases of panic because it's not so easy to stay there for 2 days waiting for orders in this very small space. But the Russians managed to probably suffer everything, and they received this final order to begin offensive operation. And the Russian soldiers landed in this area on the 8th of March, or in the early morning of the 8th of March, or in the late evening of the 7th of March. And the Ukrainian sources published their first video. And in this video published by the Ukrainian site, we can see exactly the moment when the Russians left pipeline. As you can see, there were lots of Russian soldiers, and the first thing what the Russians did when they left the pipeline was to move as close as possible towards the railways and towards the tree lines, because these tree lines were the only safe place where the Russians could stay and could survive after another Ukrainian wave of attack with artillery and cluster rounds. When When the Ukrainians discovered this very tricky operation, of course, the first thing the Ukrainians began doing, they began bombing and attacking the Russians in this area. We just finished with the video, and there were two places that were geolocated. This is the first place where Ukrainians were bombing and attacking with everything they had, and this is the second place. Based on this video and based on the area of landing point, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. We have colored this, we have added this polygon that shows approximately the territory that the Russians managed to capture when they landed infantry in this part of the Sudzha region. Before we continue, I would like to remind you that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians carried out several pipelines offensive operation. The first Russian pipeline offensive operation, correct me if I'm wrong, took place in the city of Avdiivka. That was almost the same situation. This is the city of Avdiivka. The Russians made the same thing. They entered the pipelines somewhere in this area, somewhere here, and they crossed the edge Ukrainian positions. And according to information we had in the early 2024, the Russians landed somewhere here, and that allowed the Russians, by crossing another 5 kilometers, to land their infantry behind the edge positions of the armored force of Ukraine and the first line of defense. And that operation was a turning point in the battle for Avdiivka, because after that operation, Ukrainian lines collapsed completely, and the Russians during the next several months managed to establish complete control. And now we can see the front lines like this. The Russians are on the outskirts of the city of Pokrovsk. The second pipeline offensive operation took place in the city of Toretsk. As for this territory, there was almost the same. The Russians entered their pipeline somewhere in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Gorlovka, somewhere in the vicinity of Mayorsk, somewhere here, and the Russians landed their infantry somewhere here. As for this offensive operation, this pipeline offensive operation, the Russians crossed up to 3 kilometers, and also they landed behind the first defense line of the armored forces of Ukraine. After that, the lines collapsed completely, and the Russians managed to establish control over this territory and almost over the entire Toretsk agglomeration. Of course, now the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack, but currently this is a completely different story. Now let's return back to Sudzha, where the Russians carried out their third successful pipeline operation, and this operation led to significant result, to significant victory to the armored force of Russian Federation. So let's return back. When the Russians landed infantry, they managed to take under control this small, let's say, island, and managed to create the first island of resistance. The Ukrainians began bombing and attacking the Russians, of course, and after Ukrainians realized that most likely they have no chances to destroy the Russians, most likely when the Ukrainians realized that even if they are able to destroy these Russian troopers, it will not stop this process, because 100 soldiers was just the first wave of attack, and obviously after the first wave there were the second wave, the third wave, the fourth wave, and many other waves that entered this territory through the same pipelines. This is the first thing, and the second thing, of course, is the spirit of Ukrainian soldiers, because when they realized the Ukrainians during the 8th and 7th and the 9th of March were expecting the Russians and artillery strikes on the Russian positions somewhere here in the vicinity of Belshoye Soldatska, the Ukrainians were expecting that Ukrainians would bomb the Russians in the area of Pushkarne. The Ukrainians were expecting that the Ukrainian artillery forces would bomb and attack the Russians in Ruskaya Porechna. And there was just one thing that Ukrainians didn't expect at all, that the Ukrainians would begin bombing the Russian positions far behind their backs. And that was a turning point in Ukrainian resistance, in their spirit, and of course in their willing to continue fighting for this front line. The Ukrainians made just one possible solution: to start retreat, to start running away from this area, saving their lives, and the Ukrainians began retreat process. At first that was organized retreat, when the Ukrainians were trying to move along the roads, when the Ukrainians were trying to build convoys, where the Ukrainians tried to save as many as possible vehicles, soldiers, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, personnel carriers, and so on. But several hours later they realized that they have no chances to carry out everything under control, and they basically dropped the situation situation, and they began running, every single group fighting for their own lives, trying to save their own lives without any understanding what is happening with probably neighboring group or neighboring brigade. And when the Ukrainians began running from their positions, several maybe minutes later, several hours later, we start receiving first videos from the Russian side. For example, in this video we can see how the armored forces of Russian Federation answered the settlement by the name of Cherkasskaya Porечная, and how the Russians raised their first flag in the vicinity or on the street of the Russian church in this area. So this is the first flag that we got during the previous 48-24 hours that confirms Russian control over this territory. By the time the Russians were raising their flag in this area, there were no more Ukrainians. Probably there were several pockets of resistance, but by the time we start making this video, most of those pockets were destroyed, and the Russians managed to capture significant number of Ukrainians as prisoners of war. Anyway, the Ukrainians began retreat process, and first, as we discussed, they were trying to build convoys, they were trying to save as many as possible vehicles, and the Ukrainians began retreating, and then they faced the first problem. And the first problem was that the Russians that landed from the pipelines managed to take under control this territory, the intersection of the railways and the regular road, which was very close to this industrial zone. And the Ukrainians realized that they have no chances to use this road for evacuation, and they decided to move in the southern direction towards the street by the name of Oktyabrskaya. So they answered the street, and the next target for the Ukrainians was to cross the river of Sudzha and river of Loknya, and to answer first the central part of Sudzha, and probably then to move even further in the direction of the border between the Russian Federation and Ukraine itself. But the problem is that the Russians most likely knew for sure where exactly the Ukrainians are planning to move. The Russians planned this operation carefully, and obviously the Russians knew for sure where exactly the Ukrainians are planning to move, and that is why the day before the Russians began this offensive operation, the Russians destroyed the bridges in this area. The thing is that the bridges were already mined by the Ukrainians. They established significant number of big explosives below the bridges, but the Ukrainians were planning to destroy the bridges only in case when the Russians were able to break through the defense. The Ukrainians didn't expect that the Russians would destroy the bridge before the Ukrainians. So that was the main interesting point from this situation. And as you can see, this destruction of bridge tells us that the Russians planned everything carefully and in details. So the bridges were destroyed in this area. When the first convoys of the armored forces of Ukraine entered this territory, they faced that they have no chances to enter the mainland, to enter the central part, and most likely the Ukrainians in this area realized that most likely during the next several minutes this convoy, their significant convoy, would be destroyed. And that happened exactly as we discussed right now. First, the Russians destroyed the last car in the convoy because it was very important for the Russians not to allow the Ukrainians to save these vehicles. And when the last car in the convoy was destroyed, the Ukrainians in the head of the convoy realized that they currently can't turn their cars back and to move through this fire. And then the Russians began bombing and attacking this territory with mortar systems and of course with FPV drones. We have several videos. For example, in this video we can see that after the Russians managed to cover this territory with artillery fire and FPV drones, another FPV drone came to this area with the purpose to find those who managed to survive, and the Russians destroyed a few more cars in this area. And by the morning we got the final picture from this territory. These are just the pictures, and as you can see there are all these vehicles, and all these vehicles, as you can see, were completely destroyed and burned with fire. So that was the situation with those Ukrainians convoy that were trying to evacuate and to escape from Martinovka, from Cherkasskaya Porечная, and many other towns and settlements. And after all these things, the Russians answered the second stage of this offensive operation. Basically, the Russians began moving towards the Ukrainians, trying to get them through the settlement of Martinovka, Cherkasskaya Porечная. The main purpose for the Russians in this site, in this part, was to take under control this industrial zone. And during during the 9th of March, we got a lot of reports that tell us that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control first this big pocket, then the territory between Martinovka and this industrial zone, and in the end this industrial zone itself. Let's compare the map and let's take a look at how the situation was developing here. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 8th of March, and this is the situation by the end of the 9th of March. So as you can see, the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to enter the city of Sudzha, or Sudzha agglomeration itself. Then the Russians, when they realized that they managed to connect forces inside of this landing area and the mainland, they split their forces into groups. The first group of Russian forces began clearing the northern part and the northeastern part of the Sudzha. We're talking about the settlement of Mirny, we're talking about the settlement of Mirny, Bandarevka and Agronom. So the Russians began clearing operation in this territory, and another group of Russian forces began moving further along the railways in the direction of the settlement by the name of Malaya Loknya. And as a result of this offensive operation, during the 9th of March, we got reports that the settlement of Kubatkin was completely captured and secured by the Russians. Furthermore, at the same time, another group of Russian forces began moving from the settlement of Ruskaya Porечная, Cherkasskaya Porечная in the southern direction, and by the end of the 9th of March, we got report that the settlement of Pravda was also captured by the Russians. Currently, there is a significant number of Ukrainians that were caught in cauldron in Ivashkovsky. Usually, Ukrainians try to find a solution how to escape this encirclement, but most likely they will not be able to do this. And not just the Ukrainians from these forests were caught in cauldron, a significant number of Ukrainians were caught in cauldron in the area of Malaya Loknya. So this is a very huge cauldron that was created by the Russians, and for example, by the end of the 9th of March of 2025, we got another video from the settlement of Malaya Loknya, and in this video we can see how the Russian soldier raised on the highest part of the settlement and raised the Russian flag. This video appeared just right now, probably a second ago, because when I started making this video, there was no such a, let's say, video, but my assistants maybe added this video to the map, and now I'm also with you for the first time the situation. So before the next video, before the next update, we will adjust the territory of Malaya Loknya under complete Russian control. So this is the situation. Another important thing is that the Russians began their offensive operation from the northwestern part. According to information we have, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to improve their positions along the railways. The Russians have the same purpose, to get as close as possible to the settlement of Kazachia Loknya and to cut in cauldrons, a significant number of cauldrons, Ukrainian forces. During the day, we got report first in the morning from the settlement of Lebedevka. In this video, we can see how the Russian drone was flying above the central part of the settlement, and we can see two Russian soldiers that raised Russian flag and the sign of the unit that was responsible for the battle for this territory. Later, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed the same information, that the settlement of Lebedevka was completely captured and secured by the Russians. After this territory fell, the Russians began offensive further in the eastern direction towards the settlement of Lebedevka from the east and from the northeast. So the situation, as you can see, is very critical, and when summarizing everything that been taking place for the previous 24 hours, we can make a conclusion, and most likely before the next video we will adjust and we will color everything in this area in Russian color, which means territories. Currently, this territory that we just colored most likely either was already captured by the Russians or will be captured by the morning of the 10th of March, and then the battle for the city of Sudzha itself is going to start. But we don't think that Ukrainians are going to hold their positions for a very long period of time, and not because the Ukrainians don't have weapon, not because of this. The problem is with those Ukrainians who managed to escape the encirclement. Currently, you know that there are several codes for different Ukrainians. For example, when for different types of for different statuses of units, code 200 means that losses, that the soldier is dead. When talking about code number 300, a soldier is wounded. And there is another code for soldiers, code number 500. 500 means that a soldier stressed he managed to probably survived during a very, very big stress, and he's no longer available to hold arms in his hands. And the only thing he thinks is how to run away from his position as far as possible from the line of combat contact. And currently, those Ukrainians who managed to escape all these encirclements, all this Russian offensive, are located on the territory of Sudzha, and most likely this upcoming night between the 9th and 10th of March of 2025, without receiving any orders from Kursk and commanders, they will begin running towards the border with the purpose to save their lives. And of course, this will have effect not just on them, but also on those soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine who are currently located on the territory of Sudzha itself. And of course, this can force them as well to begin running from this territory as far as possible from the Russians and the Russian army. So we believe that the situation in Sudzha will be resolved in the very near future, and we are obviously not talking about days or months, we are talking maybe even about hours. So everything is going to be very fast. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously the second probably battle for Kursk most likely has already ended in the Russian favor. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk and in the South Donetsk direction. Today the Russians also raised several more flags on the territory of the settlement by the name of Constantinople. In this video we can see how the Russian soldier was moving probably on the roof of the building in the most southwestern part of the settlement, and here we can see how he established the flag. It wasn't just the only video where the Russians raised the flag. The Russian sources published few more videos. This is the video from the northwestern part. Anyway, based on all these episodes and all these videos, we have adjusted the map in the area of Constantinople completely. The Russians managed to take this village under complete control, and for example in this video we can see probably the beginning of final offensive operation. The Russian soldiers were crossing the river and moving further in the northeastern part of the settlement, and after that we start receiving videos with flags. So this is another victory for the Russians, and basically the battle for the settlement of Razliv is going to start. But we believe that Ukrainians will not hold their positions for a very long period of time, and they will retreat towards the settlement of Bogatyr. And they know that maybe now it's very difficult to project anything, because if Ukrainians indeed are going to lose the battle for Sudzha during the next several days, very likely that situation can start developing in completely unpredictable way, and obviously in Russian favor. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.